Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It is a very cold night, and yes, it is very foggy. So thank you all for making the trek out here tonight. As Ariel said, yes, I got my undergraduate degree at Boston University, and I recently got my master's degree at University of Massachusetts, Boston, lots of Boston. However, I am an archaeologist, and I am a professional archaeologist. I actually work for a cultural resource management company, which I'll get more into that a little bit. But basically, I do archaeology as my day job, 40 hours a week. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about what archaeology is before we really delve into the data and the information here. However, before we start, I'd really like to thank Blandy for having me here tonight, and Belle Grove for letting me and helping me through this research process. Everyone else that was involved in making this weekend of events happen, including the Slave Dwelling Project, the Clark County Historical Society, several others that I know I'm forgetting at this very moment. However, thank you all. And I would also like to thank the Fisk Center, which is affiliated with the University of Massachusetts Boston, for helping me with research, as well as Heritage Consultants for giving me the time off to come down and talk to you lovely people today. So, let's get started. So, as an archaeologist, wrong way. Alright, maybe. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. We're on. So, as an archaeologist, I have focused a lot on public archaeology, so public engagement, talking about my research and other people's research. And something that I've seen a lot of and have noticed is that there are a lot of misconceptions about what archaeology is. Sometimes I tell people that I'm an archaeologist and people say, dinosaur bones. And I say, no, not quite. Cool, but not quite. That would be paleontology. That's the study of fossils. Another huge misconception that I get is that every archaeologist works in a foreign country on a huge site, like Machu Picchu or the pyramids in Giza, something along those lines. Those are really awesome sites, and there has been excellent archaeology done at those sites. However, another misconception is that I'm Indiana Jones, and that I go into large ruins and I take golden idols. I don't do that. The reality of archaeology is that most of the time, especially in the United States, archaeology happens before construction. It's mitigation work. So before we go and build new buildings, if there's federal money or it's on federal land, legislation demands that the cultural resources on that land be taken into consideration. So, here are some examples of, some of them are me in the middle, that's me in the red t-shirt, actually at Belle Grove, excavating the feature that we'll be talking about tonight, and the site that we'll be talking about tonight. But most times, especially when we're doing mitigation work, we don't really find much. We don't find huge sites like Machu Picchu or the pyramids of Giza or even Cahokia in the Midwest. Most of those big sites have already been found. So when we are talking about archaeology, we're really talking about digging and finding things that are not immediately seen by the naked eye, things that have been buried, cultural deposits. So basically, most of the times we find nothing. We're walking on large corridors in the middle of New Hampshire or Maine for miles at a time, and we're digging 30 holes a day, and we find nothing. But on occasion we do find something. And when we do find something, or even when we don't find something, archaeology in general is the study of past humans through the examination of the material culture that they left behind by their activities. I discussed a lot of digging in the past few minutes. However, there are other methods that are used. There's something called ground penetrating radar, where there's a machine that shoots basically signals into the ground, and we can determine by the way that things bounce there's something there that should be either investigated or in some cases should be left intact. In general though, archaeology is the study of past humans. And when we excavate, and on the occasion that we actually do find things from material culture, from humans, they're usually very fragmented. So these are actually some examples from Belle Grove, from the site that we'll be talking about tonight. So these are all pieces of plates and ceramics that have been very, very fragmented, as well as pieces of animal bone that were found at the site. So these are examples basically of what they would have considered trash, things that were thrown away. We don't find gold. We don't find things of that nature. We usually find things that people considered trash and threw away because things that were valuable would have been kept. So from these things that we find here, archaeologists have to piece together, what does it mean? If you were looking in your own trash today, what would you piece together about our society? That's basically what we do. We consider what past humans were doing from what they leave behind. And the way we do that is through excavation, and basically there are soil levels that we call stratigraphy. And when we're digging, one of the most common questions I have is, where do we stop? It's a great question, and it depends. Depends on where we are. So, for example, we usually stop when we find a layer of soil that has to do, that is from before when humans inhabited the land. So, for example, in New England, we excavate until we find, it's usually a coarse sand. We call it glacial till, and it was left over by the glaciers when they were receding back during the last ice age. That is before humans were there. So, for example, in this lovely little diagram that I use from Binghamton University, this dinosaur here, this fossil, we would not find because we would have stopped by that point, because humans aren't on the ground at the same time as dinosaurs. So, however, each of these deposits, whenever we're digging, we find and we define each deposit of soil by their color and their texture. And as we go down, each deposit represents a different time or a different event that happened. Some of them are done by humans. Some of them are cultural deposits that are put down during construction or demolition of buildings. Sometimes it's a road, or in this case, it could be a stone wall. But some of them are just natural, and as you go down, you continue until you hit glacial till, or whatever we call the sea horizon in that region. And at that point, we stop excavating. Within the soil, we usually find features, or on occasion we find features. So features are basically soil stains. They can range in what they look like. However, some of them are very obvious, like a stone wall or a stone foundation found in the ground. If you're walking through the woods and you see a stone foundation with a huge depression in it, that would be a feature. However, most times it does not look like that, and it's not quite that obvious. Instead, we get huge soil stains in the ground. Here are some examples, and this is actually the feature that we'll be discussing tonight at Belle Grove Plantation. However, as you can see here, this is a bunch of little soil stains. They're very hard to see. They're a little ambiguous, but they were left behind by actions that humans took. So for example, we believe that these are storage pits that were used approximately 1,500 years ago. This is a different project that I'm working on. And the only thing that is left from those storage pits now is a darkened soil that is probably darkened from whatever organic materials were inside of that storage pit when it went out of disuse. This here is a post hole from Jamestown. If you go back to the coast, we're still in the state. However, as you can see, there's a difference in the soil here, and we can see where a post at one point was. So when we're excavating excavating these features, when they're located, we take extra care to look at them because oftentimes they're the only thing that are left of structures that no longer exist. So when we excavate those features, usually we cut them in half, we bisect them, and half of the soil is screened into large screens that we bring into the field so we can sift out the soil from the actual cultural material within the feature itself. And the other half of it we keep as soil samples, and we process them in the lab. The most common way to process them is to put them in water to separate the soil sediment from the cultural material, the heavy fraction, which floats to the bottom, and then the light fraction, which floats to the top. And most of the things that float to the top are botanical remains. So that's where I come in. I'm an archaeobotanist. I specialize in looking at charred plant remains that are found at archaeological sites and identifying what they were and what plants they belonged to when they were living plants, or at least when they had been taken by humans and put into this context. I say specifically charred plant remains because there are other ways to preserve plants, seeds, wood. It could be a waterlogged sample, something that was underground and just soaked and inundated by water for so long that it preserved. Another option is a completely dry conditions, so think the Sahara Desert. But we don't really get those in Virginia or very much in this area of the world. So when we do find plant remains, they've usually been completely carbonized, and that has kept them from decaying. Here are some examples of some seeds that I've identified, and that actually come from the site that we will be talking about soon. I promise we are getting to it. However, these are an example of a peach pit and a corn cob that were recovered from the feature at the site at Belle Grove. As you can see, they have been charred, they are carbonized. However, another thing that needs to be kept in mind while doing this is that denser and larger seeds often preserve better. So, in general, we find larger things more commonly, but smaller seeds are also very important and can tell a lot about the diet and the environment which we are studying. With that, I'm going to switch over to the site itself, Belle Grove Plantation. So first I'm going to situate the site. The Shenandoah Valley is where Belle Grove is located, and we are right now. And it's located in the Refuge Valley region, which is one of the 5 physiographic provinces in the state of Virginia. And it's considered to be highly biodiverse and made up of several distinctive habitats that set it apart from the rest of the state. In fact, the Shenandoah Valley is part of a larger Appalachian Valley that extends along the majority of eastern North America. Despite being the location of high agricultural production that relied on enslaved labor, historical narratives of the Shenandoah Valley have not traditionally told stories of the enslaved people who lived there up until pretty recently. Belle Grove Plantation, which is the focus of this research, resides in the valley region along Cedar Creek, which is one of the tributaries of the Shenandoah River. The Cedar Creek Valley is characterized by fertile and loamy soil, so it allows for the excellent growth of lots of wild plants, lots of wild nuts, and agricultural crops. But in spite of the valley's fertile soils, the area wasn't colonized until the 1720s because the Blue Ridge Mountains acted as a barrier to white colonizers. So when they arrived in the valley nearly a century after the initial colonization of Virginia, they found several maroon communities of runaway enslaved African Americans who had fled the slave system in eastern Virginia over the mountain ranges before white colonizers came. Despite the fact that maroon communities existed in the Ridge and Valley region before white people colonized it, and that the institution of slavery entrenched itself there afterwards, most historians until the 1990s claimed that slavery was not prevalent in the valley. This false claim was spread through the works of former enslavers, such as Joseph Waddell, who famously wrote, "The Scotch-Irish race had no love for it, and the German people were generally averse to it." Throughout the decades, historians have supported this claim in a variety of ways. One way is that they claim that the different cultural makeup of the valley compared to the Piedmont and the coastal regions made slavery less prevalent. So, as the quote earlier suggested, the Valley region was colonized by mostly German settlers, German-American settlers from up in Pennsylvania that came down, and Scotch-Irish people as well, as opposed to the eastern part of Virginia, which was colonized by English settlers. Another reason that they've given is that there was a prevalence of small family farms rather than large plantations in the valley. That is true. Generally, there were more prevalent small family farms than plantations. However, plantations did exist, and just because there were small family farms does not necessarily mean they weren't using enslaved labor. And thirdly, there were cash crops such as tobacco, sugar, and rice. However, they didn't really thrive in the valley's soil. Instead, this soil really was much better for planting and cultivating wheat, rye, grains. As a matter of fact, during the Civil War, this was called the breadbasket of the Confederacy. This was the place where grain economy truly thrived. But despite these well-circulated falsehoods, the institution of slavery entrenched itself within the region, with enslavement increasing steadily between 1790 and 1830. And by 1830, 31,626 people were enslaved in the valley. And by 1840, 21.1% of the total population of the valley was enslaved. Another reason that people deny, or in the past have said, that slavery wasn't as prevalent in the valley is because it used a different enslaved labor pattern as compared to other areas of the South. So, other areas of the South used either gang labor or task labor systems. Gang labor systems were systems where enslaved individuals were made to work from dawn to dusk, and they had to work that specific time period. However, task labor systems and gang labor systems were found in areas where sugar was processed, things such as that. So that was commonly found in the Caribbean or sometimes in Louisiana. However, there was also the task labor system, which was more commonly input in the low country of South Carolina and Georgia. This labor system was more based on the idea that there was a task, and that was a set amount of work that a person was set and necessarily had to carry out throughout the day. But it didn't matter how long it took, as long as the task was finished. So that left extra time at the end of the day. If you finished your task early, you could use that for your own means. However, the Shenandoah Valley didn't employ any of those labor patterns. Instead, they used a slave hiring system, and this meant that enslaved individuals were rented out to white enslavers during times of heavy labor. People who owned high amounts of enslaved individuals during times when the grain production was heaviest and the highest amount of labor was occurring within the system, would rent out enslaved individuals for a period of time. So they would basically do this with smaller farms, which is what I was talking about earlier, small family farms. So while they did not own large amounts of slaves like you see in the eastern part of Virginia at large plantations such as Monticello or at Mount Vernon, they usually rented out a person for a certain amount of time. This These periods of hiring out often correlated with the undulating workload associated with grain agriculture that dominated the region's economy. Now, very little archaeological work has been done in the valley itself concerning enslavement and enslaved life. An article was written in 2009 that identifies structures that were thought to have housed enslaved individuals that had been the subject of academic research. Of those, 140 archaeological sites and 35 standing structures, none were located in the Shenandoah Valley. Archaeological work in the valley concerning the lives of enslaved individuals didn't start in earnest until the late 1990s. The excavation of the Parnassus farmstead in Augusta County, Virginia, identified a cluster of subfloor pits that were attributed to an enslaved dwelling. Unfortunately, very little attention was given to exploring the lives of enslaved African Americans, and instead, the research was centered around the white family who occupied the land. But during the past decade, the archaeological excavations exploring enslaved quarters within the valley has become more common. Excavations at Liberty Hall and Buffalo Forge, which are both located in the valley, have started to produce research within the past 5 years. Two other mitigation having to do with cultural resource management, which is prior to construction, as I said. So two other mitigation-related excavations have occurred at Claremont Farm in Berryville and Stickley Quarter in Frederick County. The site that this thesis focuses on, Belle Grove's enslaved quarters, was excavated between 2015 and 2019, and thus far has produced potentially the most archaeological centered research on enslaved life within the valley. However, a lot more is being done as we speak. So, the land that Belle Grove occupies was managed by the Height family between 1748 and 1860. In 1783, Isaac Height Sr. gifted the land as a wedding present to his son, Isaac Height Jr. His intended wife was Eleanor Conway Madison, the sister of the then future president, James Madison. With her, Nellie Madison brought 15 enslaved people that were gifted to her as a wedding present from her father. These people were named Jemmy, Jerry, Eliza, and her 5 children, Joanna, Diana, Demos, Pendar, and Webster. Also True Love and her 4 children, Peggy, Priscilla, Henry, and Katie, as well as Sally and Millie. By 1795, the Height family had enslaved over 50 people, and the new couple lived on the property in what is known as Old Hall from 1783 until 1797, when their new residence was finally constructed, and that is the residence that is still on the property today. Eleanor passed away in 1802, but Isaac Height Jr. remarried a year later in 1803 to Anne Tunstall Maury. Isaac Height Jr. died in 1836, and his widow continued to manage the grounds until her death in 1851. From then on, the estate was passed between several landowners until 1964, when the property was bequeathed to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This organization is still a steward of the property in conjunction with Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park. Quarter Site B, which is the enslaved quarters at Belle Grove, was occupied from 1800 through the mid-19th century and is located approximately here, with the manor house being located right here. Although the Height family kept a very detailed record of the enslaved individuals they owned, it's uncertain how many people were living in Belle Grove's enslaved quarters at a time, as the Height family owned 4 land tracts in the immediate area. Therefore, it's currently unknown how these individuals were dispersed between them. However, we think that potentially up to 40 or 50 people were living in enslaved quarters. We don't have an exact number though. This site was identified during an archaeological survey completed by Clarence Geer in 1993 and 1994. Matthew Greer conducted phase 1 excavations in the summer of 2015 for his dissertation research at Syracuse University and tried to relocate the site. And once the site was relocated and its boundaries were redefined, it was excavated between the summers of 2016 and 2019. And during the excavation of the site, we found a huge deposit of scorched earth that had a lot of charred food remains, charcoal, and artifacts, some of which you saw the photos of earlier. This area was soon identified as the footprint of a burned down log cabin. If you look at the map here and try to imagine, let's go back. So the site's here, and this is spatially where the site is. So this is a cluster of units where we found the footprint of the log cabin. So this is approximately here in the site itself. The cellar was broken down into two separate features, feature 3 and feature 24. So feature 3 was an earlier cellar that was dug out around 1800 and was used until the late 1830s when it was filled back in. Feature 24 was a subfloor pit feature that was dug out from the filled-in earlier cellar and was used from the late 1830s until the 1850s when the house burned down. We believe the house burned down in the 1850s due to some artifacts that we found in there that usually correlate to that time period. And that also is how we figured out the dates for the rest of the cellar that I just indicated. And from that, between those two features, we found 51 different plant taxa, and that was only out of half of the samples. For my master's thesis, I only completed half of the samples. There are still 89 samples in there. Of these samples and of these taxa, they ranged from a large amount. As you can see, this is a corn cob, but this here is a sunflower seed, something that can be found in the wild or can be found in a garden. And this here is a Chickasaw plum pit, something that grows in the area. So we have evidence of crops, wild plants, and nuts, and they were used, and we have evidence that they were used for things more than just food, which is something that I'll get into in a bit. However, the plants come from a variety of environments, as well. So they're agricultural crops. Some of them grow best in disturbed soils, which can be found in the side of cropland that was not currently being used, as well as wetlands, which would correlate really well with the enslaved quarters' proximity to Cedar Creek. So then, once we have all this data, the question is, how do we think about it? What do we think about these plants and the evidence of this plant's use in this area? One way to think about it is, how are they cultivated? Are they wild or are they purposely planted? So we found evidence of wheat at the site. Wheat is something that is obviously cultivated and was cultivated by Isaac Hite as part of his plantation, as part of his economic endeavors. However, Chickasaw plum is something that grows in the wild and never was really cultivated or transplanted into kitchen gardens. Usually they're found on the side of areas with disturbed soil. Nowadays you'll find them on the side of roads because that's where you'll find lots of disturbed soil. We also found evidence of mint, wild mint, and that's something that would grow in the wild, but it can also be transplanted into a person's garden. People do it even today. People grow their own herbs in their houses. So, and this here is Jimson weed, which isn't edible, but it can be used as a medicine and grows wild and is native to this area. So that's one way to think about it. Where is it growing? Was it cultivated purposefully, or was it gathered because it was there and it was opportunistic? Or was it something that originally started to grow in the wild, but then was taken and transplanted into someone's garden? Another way to think about it is, what were their uses? I mean, how did humans utilize these plants? So going back to the plants up here, wheat. Your first thought, obviously, food. Wheat is food. You make flour, you make porridge, but also Maybe they weren't using it for their own food. Maybe it was something that was being made for someone else's food. Another question, Chickasaw plum. Okay, food, definitely. But how are they processing it? Are they eating it raw? Are they making preserves? These are questions that we think about. Mint, an excellent flavor when you're making food. I love mint in my food. Love mint tea. However, it's also medicinal. Medicinal, it's good for stomachs, for bad stomachs, and was used medicinally, traditionally, by enslaved African Americans. There are folk medicine books that were published that show mint as a medicinal herb, and that's still used today. Same goes for Jimson weed. Jimson weed, definitely not edible, but it is great for pain relief. It was also used as a vermifuge, if I believe, if I remember correctly. So these are different ways to think about the plants, about the data that I was finding in this data set, and trying to contextualize, okay, what does this all mean? Another way to think about it is, how are they obtained? We're going to think about subsistence strategies now. So, question is, how did these plants come to be in this house when it had burned down? Most of them were brought there by humans. There's some that might have just been dragged in, you know. There are some wild grasses, although we'll get to that later. Some of them probably were just dragged in from the environment surrounding them. You know, you can't keep your house completely clean. Lord knows I can't. But there are also things that were likely brought in for specific purposes. So, how were they obtained? So, to start considering this, I created, well, there was already a model that had been created, the produced, procured, and provisioned model that was made by Jessica Bowes. However, I then said, well, what about purchase power? And that's something we're going to talk about. So provisioned food, for the sake of this model, is going to talk about food that was given to the enslaved by the enslaver. Produced food were plants cultivated by enslaved persons within their own gardens. And it was traditional and common that enslaved individuals had their own gardens or their own garden plots where they could cultivate their own crops to supplement their own diet. This was often encouraged by enslavers, as a matter of fact, because it meant that they didn't have to feed their enslaved individuals as much. So they encouraged enslaved people to go and produce their own food in their own time. Another category is procured, plants that were gathered from the environment surrounding them. This can mean things that were gathered in the woods, and this can also mean procured through theft and other means. And then the final category is purchased, and these would be plants that were obtained through a mutually agreed upon transaction between either two individuals or an individual and an economic entity such as a company. Though these categories represent different subsistence strategies, they're fluid. So a plant could belong to multiple categories, like I was saying before with where did they come from. So this is not really a solid way to categorize thought. It is a way to start thinking and trying to think about how people could have gotten these plants. And really, once you start thinking about it and you start looking at historical documents and merchant ledgers, other things start to come to play. But the people making these decisions, we have to keep in mind, kept the consequences of their subsistence strategies in mind. So they were weighing the choices of how to best obtain plant parts or plant goods for food consumption, medicinal and fuel use, and economic means against their absolute necessity. So processing for a second. So at quarter site B, we found evidence of wheat, rye, oats, and corn, and they were prevalent within the samples themselves, with corn being the most common throughout all of the strata or all of the samples themselves. The identification of these unprocessed grains indicated that storage of grains occurred in the domestic sphere. In addition, we found a wheat raucus, which is the part of the wheat stalk that holds the grain of wheat to the stalk. We found a wheat raucus and several corn cobs and corn copules, which does the same job as the wheat raucus, but on a cob. And they were identified within the samples, and that indicates that processing of these grains occurred in the area. So this is very interesting because Isaac Hite Jr. kept fastidious records of the plantation, and there were no records of grains such as wheat, rye, and oats being used as rations. In fact, Isaac Hite Jr. has records of selling additional flour to enslaved workers, indicating that any rations given would have been previously ground into flour or the more typical cornmeal. So that begs the question, how were they processed? So in order to look at this, I investigated 12 merchant ledgers and 4 mill records that were compiled by Matthew Greer from surrounding Frederick, Shenandoah, and Jefferson counties that listed several instances of enslaved workers selling or purchasing goods. While there's no mention of flour or other grains being purchased by enslaved individuals within the 12 merchant records, there is evidence of these transactions within the mill records. In the spring mill ledger, the majority of these transactions, of which there were 60, were purchases of processed grains, although one transaction included an enslaved individual paying to have his own personal rye milled. So this is evidence of, while not where this rye came from specifically, but evidence of enslaved individuals engaging with the economy, hanging to either buy flour with fungible money or to have their own personal rye milled. So as the majority of grain transactions between enslaved individuals and white merchants pertain to grains that had already been processed, it's unlikely that the grains recovered from the cellar features were purchased at a merchant store or a mill. There is the possibility that the grains were procured through the process of gleaning. So gleaning is when people gather grain or other produce left by reapers. That's a possibility. Though this was a practice that occurred on occasion, there's no written evidence of it occurring at Belle Grove, but it's unlikely that there would have been written evidence of it. It wouldn't have been mentioned by enslavers in their own personal writings. Although written evidence and regional comparative cases make it difficult to offer a definitive interpretation for the acquisition of the identified grains, grains such as wheat and rye are inedible except as porridge, flour, or alcohol. So it stands to reason that the people who lived in this cabin had a way of processing the grains themselves. Charles Ball recalls that his enslaver provided corn weekly and that the enslaved had to grind the corn into meal in a hand mill for themselves. While it's possible that the grains found in the subfloor pit were to be ground by hand, there's no stone grounding tools that were recovered from the site. And that's something that we would expect to see at an archaeological site, especially one, this feature, that burned down so quickly that it's unlikely that the people who left the cabin in a hurry were going to grab a stone grinding tool. So the fact that we didn't find one is very suspicious. However, while it's possible, in addition, there is little historical evidence to suggest that this was a tactic that the Hite family commonly employed. However, the Hite family owned a mill and a distillery that's located less than a mile from the enslaved quarters. There is a possibility that the Hites hired free white laborers to run the mill and distillery. However, in other parts of the valley, it was common for enslaved workers to do highly specialized work. Buffalo Forge, an iron forge that's located in Rockbridge County, Virginia, The majority of the workforce was enslaved. This meant that the most specialized positions in the iron-making process were filled by highly trained enslaved workers. Similarly, at Belle Grove, there was an enslaved man named Daniel who was trained as a blacksmith and lived on the premises, and the additional evidence of an enslaved shoemaker and carpenter. Therefore, it's likely that at one point throughout Belle Grove's history, both the mill and the distillery were operated by enslaved workers, the same people who would have inhabited the structures at Portishead Bay. This would potentially provide access to the mill and a way to process grains into flour. And while there's no written evidence of such occurrences, they likely happened after working hours or possibly without explicit permission. So this is one explanation for how these grains would have been processed. It's also possible that enslaved individuals were paying for their grains to be milled, such as we mentioned before, the one enslaved man in the mill records that paid for his own rye to be milled. However, this seems like it was an uncommon practice because we only see one instance of it in 4 mill records. The rest of the mill records show enslaved individuals purchasing already pre-milled grains. While enslaved individuals were customers of the mills that were part of the formal economy, it appears that most of these transactions were purchases of processed grains and didn't include the processing of grains. So enslavers turned a blind eye to food acquisition activities so long as they didn't interfere with the work schedule of the enslaved or involve theft. Therefore, moments such as these wouldn't have been commonly mentioned in historical writings by enslavers or by people who, I'm sorry, I forget the name, by enslavers or people who watched over. Overseers. Thank you, overseers. Wow, I was really on the roll. Thank you. By overseers. As long as it didn't interfere with the work schedule or involve theft, these wouldn't have been written in written records. And so it wouldn't be seen in written records when we're looking at what Black life was like in the valley. This is an instance where macrobotanical data and archaeological data in general can help supplement the historical documents that most people look to when they're trying to piece together the past. Another example is, we're going to switch our gears now from grain processing to preserve making. So throughout the samples, we found a high density of fruit remains that were usually preserved fruits. So those include peaches, Chickasaw plum, sour cherry, and choke cherry. These fruits reflect the exploitation of a diversity of wild and domestic plants. Once again, demonstrating the dynamic ways that enslaved individuals obtained enough food for survival under the eyes of their captors. Chickasaw plum is a wild fruit that grows frequently in the coastal plain and the Piedmont regions of Virginia, but it's fairly rare throughout the Shenandoah Valley. One of the few places it does grow in the valley is Frederick County along Cedar Creek. These plums were most likely gathered from the woods surrounding Belle Grove in an effort to supplement their rations. The same can be said about choke cherry, however, it's more prevalent in the region than Chickasaw plum. Peaches and sour cherries, however, are identified as domesticated foods, and this indicates that they were obtained in a different manner, and depending on the interpretation, it changes the personal cost that an enslaved individual was putting on the line when obtaining that food. In Frederick Douglass's slave narratives, he wrote, "Scarcely a day passed during the summer, but that some slave had to take the lash for stealing fruit." In fact, there are 47 instances where theft was mentioned in WPA narrative interviews, indicating that stealing was a fairly common occurrence. There is evidence that enslavers occasionally allowed those they enslaved to pick peaches from their orchards. Charles Ball, in his slave narratives, wrote, "To add to our happiness, the early peaches were now ripe, and the overseer permitted us to send to the orchard and gather at least 10 bushels of very fine fruit." Additionally, he recalls that they were allowed to take 3 bushels of peaches every day, And what they did eat, at least 3 times that quantity, for we stole at night that which was not given to us. In this case, the evidence of theft was camouflaged by the peaches willingly given by the enslaver, but this could have happened at Belle Grove, where the Height family kept an orchard on the premises. However, the extent of the 19th century orchard is currently unknown. Similarly, there are no records currently known to us that indicate that peaches were cultivated there. In addition, the high quantities of peaches found in the cellar features make it seem unlikely that this was solely a case of theft. Stealing fruit would have had a huge personal cost if an enslaved person were caught, and with the palpable threat of physical violence, it seems unlikely that evidence of a punishable crime would be left so blatantly in their homes. And with the high amounts, I want to say we found 20 peach pits. That's a large amount of peaches. So this leaves the possibility that these peaches were purchased. A ledger from Buffalo Forge lists transactions between William Weaver and the enslaved workers at the forge, and lists the purchases they made. One such transaction was made by Harry Hunt Sr., one of the laborers at the forge, when he bought a half bushel of peaches for $1. Purchases such as these indicate that it was possible for enslaved Shenandoahans to purchase specialty plant items for their own personal use, thus affecting the local markets with their purchases and consumer choices. It is likely that this high density of fruits were utilized to make preserves. Ceramic and residue analysis that was conducted by Matthew Greer on ceramic sherds recovered from quarter site B, some of them from the feature itself, indicate that enslaved individuals were making preserves. It has been argued before that preserve making for personal consumption was an uncommon food preparation used by enslaved Southerners because the process necessitated large amounts of sugar, something that was not often provisioned and came at a huge monetary expense. However, when we're looking at merchant ledgers, it's clear that enslaved individuals engaged with the formal economy to purchase goods such as sugar. In a 1795 merchant ledger from an unknown store in Charlestown, 15% of all transactions made by enslaved individuals were for purchasing sugar. In fact, sugar is listed as a purchase made by enslaved individuals within 8 of the 12 merchant records transcribed by Matthew Greer, and in addition, in the Weaver ledger. I'm actually pretty sure. Yeah, right here. 2 coffee, 2 pounds sugar. Molasses, sugar. So, with this, the purchase of sugar by enslaved individuals indicates several things. First, it demonstrates that they had the ability to gather ingredients to produce preserves, thus adding another technique to making food long-lived. This made it possible for enslaved individuals to store food for longer periods of time. It also demonstrates that enslaved Southerners were engaging with the formal economy of the region to produce food. By investigating the macrobotanical remains of the site and the merchant records in tandem, specific actions taken by enslaved individuals to engage with the formal economy come to light. Last but not least, I'm going to talk about basket making. So I mentioned the wild grasses before, and I said some of them likely have to do with the overall just like area that the enslaved quarters were in. However, there were a lot of wild grasses, lots of wild grass seeds in there, and that can indicate a few things. One is that it was traditional for enslaved individuals to sweep their floors and sweep their lawns and make lawn space with brooms made from wild grasses and sedges. Another possibility is that in the Shenandoah Valley, we have extensive evidence of enslaved individuals selling items to merchants and their enslavers to earn money. Most times, this is listed as eggs or as they were given permission to raise chickens or to raise pigs or other livestock so they could sell eggs or keep eggs for their own consumption. However, sometimes this extends to flora, and that was gathered to make goods for sale. So, for example, in 1860, a merchant record says that a young enslaved boy sold a basket for 14 cents. 14 cents doesn't sound like a lot, but as I'll tell you guys later, the purchase power of money has changed enormously, which I don't think anyone here will be surprised to hear with the way inflation is. So basket making occurred in most of the South, and it was a tradition carried over from West Africa, where baskets were made by weaving grasses together. These baskets were then brought to markets for sale, or for own personal use. Several species of wild grasses were recovered from the subfloor pit feature that was shown above, and that all this data comes from. Enslaved people also made and sold other items composed of wild grasses and sedges, such as mats and brooms. While some of the wild grasses recovered from features 3 and 24 represent the fields that surround the enslaved quarters, it's likely that some of them represent the utilization of grasses for basket weaving and economic activity. So why does this matter? I've just stood here for about an hour telling you all about plants and archaeology. Why does it matter? So, I think it matters because this presentation has showed ways that archaeology can be used as a tool to supplement the written record that has been systemically and purposefully altered to speak only to white experiences, and most times, white, straight, male experiences. Archaeology is a way to look at the daily lives and actions of people as they lived it. And specifically, this site and this feature is a snapshot in the life of the Black folks that lived in that cabin. So, I think that looking at these plants not only can show us about the daily lives of Black folks in the valley, but it can show how they used plants and how they used plants to navigate their world and how they navigated their world in general. By looking at the written record and the plants in general, we can see that enslaved individuals were engaging with the economy of the Shenandoah Valley. Lots of previous research, when they talk about enslaved economic engagement as enslaved individuals as consumers and producers, they call it internal economies or slave economies, thus indicating that it didn't really have an effect. But as we can see, enslaved individuals were affecting and acting as producers and consumers within the regional economy itself. And it also brings the question, why were they doing this? Obviously, some of it was to procure money. Some of it was to procure extra food or some specialty goods to make their lives a little more bearable. But I also think some of it was to save money and for hope. And I think that comes most clear in this moment in 1856. An enslaved man named Sam Williams, who labored as a master refiner at Buffalo Forge, had a savings account that held $91.31. And his wife, Nancy Williams, had a savings account at a bank in her name that held $61.96 that she earned through working beyond her daily quota, and by making things to sell for fungible money. That accumulated $153.27, held between both Sam and Nancy in 1856, today has the equivalent spending power of approximately $5,470. What were they saving for? You don't save for something unless you don't have hope. Perhaps they were saving to potentially buy their own freedom one day. Perhaps they were saving money with the hopes that their own children would one day have the chance to use that money to make a better life. This is something that through looking at the archaeological data and the written record in tandem, we see discrete moments where people were acting as economic agents, and through their agency, we're trying to hold on to hope. And I think that's why it matters. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions or comments or anything you want to say, I will happily answer them now. Hi, Kristen. Hi.
I had a question about the rye.
Yes.
So, what you depict, the slide showed, was that like a kernel that would have been like prior to grinding?
Yes. So all of the rye, so this is actually wheat, but yes. So these are, all of these numbers here, this is the amount of seeds per liter of soil that were found in each of the different units. The feature was excavated in 3 foot by 3 foot units, and then excavated by soil strata. And here you can see this is oat and rye, so the density within each area. So as you can see, we had pretty large amounts of rye only in one area, which is interesting. It shows that it was being stored in one area, or potentially it was like a single purchase situation. However, that's something I need to think about more. But yes, it was all the things that I'm showing here are kernels that would have been before processing.
Okay, so someone had like a sack, perhaps. So
Yes.
that's, because I guess my question was if they were workers in the mill, could this be like stuff that's stuck to their clothes, but not when you see that big orange stripe. So that's a lot.
Yeah.
In one unit, especially.
Yeah.
So it looks like it's possibly storage space.
Yes. So I had the first thought as you. I had the same thought initially because when I was originally going through the samples, there was a point when I didn't see wheat or rye or oats or anything like that for a long period of time. And I was like, oh, I only have like 2 or 3 pieces of wheat. This is probably from the environment that they're in. They're working in fields, they're bringing things attached to their clothes. But I think in total I found something close to like 30 to 40 different grains, like completely, and like in spatial, like very spatially clustered. So that indicates to me that, yeah, it's probably storage. Yes?
Are there plans to start excavating to find better information about what orchard would have been at Belle Grove and what they might have grown?
At this point, I do not think there are any future. At this point, I'm not saying that no archaeology will ever happen at Belle Grove again, but right now, I don't think there's any archaeology. And if we were to excavate in the area that we think the orchard is, we wouldn't really be able to tell what plants were planted there. We might be able to tell spatially how things were organized, but any plants themselves or the trees themselves, the trees will be gone. But the seeds themselves also would have decayed at this point. The only reason that these are still here is because they've been carbonized. So since it's an area that would have been for growing, I wouldn't expect to find any carbonized seeds. That would potentially be able to show us how it was spatially organized though, which would be interesting. They're actually doing something at Williamsburg right now, or at least last winter they were, to look at how a garden was organized. So that's pretty interesting work, but I don't think that's currently in the books. Yeah.
So this is a question, something to file away so you remember.
All right.
So I remember to send you later.
Okay.
The Leroy Valley Museum in Page County has a blanket chest and possibly a basket by a man named Shenandoah, who was a free black man. I took a picture a couple weeks ago, so his life date for 1813 to 1864. Okay. So, to my knowledge, that's the only, if these objects are actually made by him, the only basket that I know of made by a black person in the valley prior to the Civil War. So, not quite the same in terms of enslaved economy, making it to but it's probably as close as we're going to get to seeing examples. It's made very much in the Appalachian English traditions coming down into the Piedmont.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so remind me some more info about that later.
Yes, I would like to see
He
that.
also probably made rooms.
Okay.
The more research needs to be done on him, but there are a few scanned documents that speak to that part of the story.
Awesome, thank you. I would definitely like to hear more about that and see that potentially. Does anyone have any more thoughts or questions? Yes?
For the plant material that you're finding, is that just ID visually, or do you use any kind of chemical processing to ID?
So I specifically, I'm gonna answer this in a roundabout way. So there are different ways to identify plant matter or plant materials in the archaeological record. I specialize in macrobotanical analysis, and that's things that can be seen with the naked eye. I generally use a microscope to look at them and get better details, and then use a comparative collection of modern day samples because it's the closest that I can get. I can't time travel and get samples from the time period. But there are other ways, other microbotanical analyses that can be done that do use chemicals and such. There are plant parts called phytoliths, and then, which are basically pieces of silica that are in grassy kind of plants, and they can stay in sediment for a very long time. So if you take a sediment sample and do a lot of things that I am not qualified to do or qualified to analyze, you can potentially see phytoliths in the sample, and that usually is like if there was like a grass mat on the floor, like or something like that decayed there, you'll be able to see the silica. You can also do pollen analysis, but once again, that's not a me thing. I can't do that. I have friends that do that, and I think it's really cool, but that's not a me thing. But yes, no chemicals for me, just looking under a microscope and using modern day comparative collections. Yes?
Your comment there, that no records of unprocessed grains as rations,
Yes.
is that no written records at Belle Grove? Or are you speaking of a larger record on slaveholders' rations?
No written records at Belle Grove. Yes, no written records at Belle Grove. So Charles Ball, in his slave narratives, did mention that corn was given to them unprocessed, and they were expected to grind it themselves in hand mills. So at Belle Grove, though, there is no records of unprocessed grains that we have uncovered. Of course, potentially something could pop up, but from what me and my colleagues have looked at, not. Yes.
Oh yeah. So how large was this site altogether? Because if there was it like, do you think like there was a garden large enough to feed potentially 6-7 people?
So that's a great question. Which way am I going? I'm going the right way. Cool. Sorry, technology. So this is the manor house, and this is generally the site. So I'm trying to like think of how large it is. It's fairly large, but we don't know how many people were living there. However, the way that things at other plantations, and generally it's thought to have worked with gardens, is that each person or each family unit would have had like a kitchen garden around their home. And I didn't get to talk about this, but I think that's where the sunflower came from. We found lots of sunflower seeds. Those are of course edible, but they also could have been used as ornamental things outside and cultivated in gardens. But for the larger crops like corn, or if they were growing their own rye and their own grains, in other parts of the South, we don't have written confirmation of this at Belle Grove, but at other parts of the South, it was pretty common to give a certain amount of land to the enslaved laborers themselves so they could cultivate their own food. So within the actual quarter site itself, it would have probably been like a kitchen garden, but the garden plot would have been elsewhere, like the larger one for like larger crops.
Oh.
Yes. Yes.
So is there evidence that you found that the enslaved quarter site engaged as a community rather than a family, but the entire community might share a larger area to grow community-wide instead of?
I mean, that definitely could have happened. We haven't found evidence one way or another, but I do know that also through engaging with the economy, while I specifically focused on the formal economy because a lot of work has been done on internal or slave economies beforehand, a lot of, in general, bartering and selling of goods was done at smaller market level markets. So within the enslaved quarter itself, I don't have evidence for specific community building or specifically like a communal area where things are kept. We do have areas where trash was thrown, but like specific areas that were designated as like the garbage spot. But in general, lots of the markets where enslaved individuals went and sold their wares were also places where community was built. Sorry, community was built. So nothing in the archaeological record, but in general, things that were found within the WPA did lots of interviews with people who had been enslaved during the 1930s. So a lot of evidence of those types of interactions are found within the interviews themselves, within slave narratives, and within just writings from the time period. So, unfortunately, archaeology does have its limits. Anything else? Oh, yes, sorry.
Oh, great talk, Linda. Thanks so much.
Oh,
I was
thank
just wondering if there was one particular finding or part of your research process that you personally found to be really surprising.
Let me think. Honestly, the merchant ledger that I found, it's at UVA, so thank you, UVA. It was at UVA, and I had been reading a book written by Charles Dew about Buffalo Forge, and I was reading through, and they specifically mentioned peaches in the merchant ledgers. I got very excited, and I planned a trip down to Virginia immediately, because I live in Connecticut. And I was like, I have to go, I have to see this, I have to figure this out. And I went in, and unfortunately I had limited time, but being able to see what my research was telling me actually written out in ink, and seeing the daily actions of a person written down in ink, I think that was very powerful. Yes. Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So of your unprocessed samples, or when you had all of your samples and were making decisions of what to process or not, what was that decision like? Do you have a lot of the unprocessed ones are like a lot of the same type of thing?
So,
or all the ones that were different?
So that's a good question. I actually had that on my slides, but I cut it out because I wasn't sure if people would be interested in my thoughts. So basically, when we excavated the feature, we excavated it, as I said, in units, but also in strata, and how the feature was filled in as it burned down. But certain parts of it were very thick, so at that point we started splitting it into, what did we do? I want to say it was like, I'm sorry, down here we use tenths of a foot as measurement, and up in Connecticut we use metric, so I'm trying to remember and do the conversions. But basically it was like 10 centimeters. Every 10 centimeters we changed just to make sure that we weren't missing something as we were going down. And during each of those, we took at least one 2-liter sample from each of those levels. So as we were going through and as I looked through the samples, I wanted to make sure that I had at least one sample from each strata and each level, because at some of them we took 8 samples and we were finding a lot of things. We were like, get as much dirt as you can, take it back. In that case, I would look and see and make sure that we had at least one sample from each strata, and if there were areas with large amounts of botanicals coming out, and I had already gotten at least one thing from all of the strata, at that point I would say, okay, let's start reevaluating what areas seem to have a lot of botanical material and a lot of potential to yield new taxa that I haven't found yet. So yeah, that was kind of the thought process. And I don't think I mentioned this, but this research so far is only the seeds and the nuts that I identified. I haven't looked at the wood yet, so that's a whole different animal. But when I look at the wood, I'll be able to tell what wood the log cabin was most likely made out of, and see if it was made from all one wood, or if there are multiple woods that indicate that it was I'm sorry, words are escaping me, if it was fixed at some point, and different woods were used.
Excuse me, are you planning on making that investigation?
Yes, I am hoping to make that investigation. I have to apply for funding, but yes, I am planning to do that investigation. And I'm hoping to get through the rest of the botanical remains as well. Hopefully within a year or so. It's a lot of work, and I also do botanical stuff for my actual job, where they're like, Linda, are you done with that yet? And I'm like, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm not. But this is something that I do plan to continue. So, yeah. Yes?
Was the American chestnut, have you come across that in your research at all, or?
So, no, surprisingly not. I can tell you what I did find nut-wise, though. Most of the nuts, I actually only found 2 types of nuts in the sample, which was pretty interesting, or at least so far. I found a lot of black walnut, and I found a lot of hickory nut. It's interesting because hickory nut looks a lot like pecan. But from what I'm seeing, the difference is that hickory nut has little wings inside of it, because the nut, like the meat of the nut itself, is like put into like little quadrants within the nut itself. Pecan doesn't have that. So I'm pretty sure that all the things that I found from the hickory family, or they're from the same family, the Caria family, I'm pretty sure they were all hickory. So mostly hickory and black walnut, nut-wise. Although, like I said, there's more. We don't know, because the other thing is, while I got something from each quadrant, each layer, I mean, depending on where it was gathered from, it could show a different area if it was all being stored in one spot. So I could get a sample that I come up with, and it's just chock full of chestnut. We don't know. Still more to come. Oh, and also, only half of the feature was excavated. There is still half of that cellar that we left intact, because we think it's important to leave things intact unless we think we'll get more knowledge from it. Archaeology is inherently destructive. Once you dig it, you can't put it back. So we're leaving it intact. We usually try to leave things partially intact, just hoping that someday archaeology will have made strides technology-wise. Maybe they'll be able to do something that we couldn't do. So we left it partially in there. All right, if there are no more questions, I will say thank you. Thank you all for listening to me. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and I hope you come and enjoy the rest of the programming for the rest of the weekend. I know that there are some really great talks tomorrow being given by people from the Slave Dwelling Project that are happening right up the road at the mill. So thank you much.